massive fatigue. Still women have no right, no guarantee to liberty. Child help, wealth, property. We'll raise our banner across this land, 'cause franchise isn't just the right of a man. You never saw. Yeah, you never saw. You know we don't want to take freedoms from you, just want our rights and nothing less. We cry for freedom, oh, hear our voice and see we're equal to all men. We the whole people, not just male citizens, form this most perfect union. Caught in a bad romance. Caught in a bad romance.
All right, lovers of history, that is Bad Romance, Lady Gaga. That is a parody off YouTube from Sumo Publishing. You got to watch this video. If you haven't seen this video, it's a great video. It's a parody of Lady Gaga's song and talking about the struggles for equality for women and the eventual passage of the 19th Amendment. And that's going to be a key focus today. We're going to talk about the National Women's Party and the Equal Rights Amendment. It's a big part of the 1920s. A lot of social issues and economic issues in this video. Let's talk some economics, work, exchange, and technology, putting America on rubber tires, and the advent of the gasoline age. So the Model T, we already talked about this a little bit in the last video, but it boomed the automobile industry. And this is a highlight this. This is the greatest industry of the 1920s and probably the greatest industry of the 20th century is the automobile. And more people were able to get cars, to afford cars, and more people were able to get jobs because of the automobile industry. And the automobiles took over the railroads. Thank goodness, because I can't pronounce this very well. I spent the last 3 months trying to figure it out. I still can't do it. So in the 1920s, a new industry took over for a dying industry, and you see that a lot in history. All right, unfortunately, the automobiles were not very safe, many accidents, but the car brought adventure, excitement, especially to young boys and girls in the 1920s, and it changed America forever. And like I mentioned, the most important invention of the 1900s. We had to do some historical thinking of the 1800s, the greatest invention. I'd probably go with the railroad. Okay, I probably think that changed the 1800s. In the 1700s, maybe the cotton gin. Okay, even though that was in 1793. Highlight this: the Model T price does decrease dramatically, and so this is important. Over from 1908 to 1924, 16-year period, it was a car that ordinary Americans could afford, and it was one of the greatest inventions in American history. I already mentioned the price went down, and this graph does a good job showing the visual. 1908, around $800, but because of the assembly line and mass production of Henry Ford, the price dropped rather dramatically. By 1924, less than $300. The Model T, a car that ordinary Americans could afford. Thank you, Henry Ford. All right, more inventions we need to talk about. Let's talk about the airplane. Let's talk about the Wright brothers. Orville and Wilbur Wright, not Redenbacher, but Wright were the first ones to fly a plane in North Carolina in 1903 in December. They were able to fly for 12 seconds. All right, so World War I is benefited by the airplane, and pilots were used mostly to deliver mail, also to spy on the enemy, not really to fight as much, but it was very important, the airplane. The transcontinental airmail route was established from New York to San Francisco, so it was easier to transport mail. Again, the railroad is becoming less important in the 1900s because of the automobile and also the airplane. All right, we got to highlight this. The greatest hero, maybe of the 20th century, but definitely the 1920s, Charles Lindbergh. Even greater to me than Babe Ruth. He becomes the first person to fly a solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean going from New York to Paris. His name of his plane was the Spirit of St. Louis. Flew by himself. Dozens of other people tried to fly across the Atlantic. Unfortunately, many of them failed and died in their quest. But he did it, and he is the greatest hero in the age of heroes of the 1920s. Wow, more inventions. The radio, another huge invention in the 1920s. It was invented a little bit before that, but it does not become big really until the 1920s. The first radio station for kicks and giggles was called KDKA, the first ever radio station out of Pittsburgh, and actually covered Harding's presidential victory. All right, so I'd highlight this. Radio, newspaper, magazines, and movies. These were all part of the mass media. And the mass media was becoming very important in the 1920s, and it was a way for people to get information quicker, and it created a national culture. People in Michigan were listening to the same radio programs as people in California. They're reading the same magazines because these means of mass media create a national culture, and Americans could identify with things with other Americans across the country. And these things also very important economic help fuel the consumer economy because of advertising, and we became a consumer-based economy. For better or worse, we need people to spend money to grow the economy. All right, more communication. Let's talk about movies. In Hollywood, in Los Angeles, California, becomes the home of movies, and it became possible in the early 1900s. I would highlight this. I think this is interesting. The first ever talking movie was The Jazz Singer by a guy named Al Jolson was the star of this. He was a white person, but actually he was painted black. Okay, so he was supposed to be African American in the movie. This is the first movie with actual talking. All the movies before this were silent movies. Probably the most famous silent movie star was Charlie Chaplin and the Latin lover Rudolph Valentino. All right, so many of the early movies were definitely risque, and there was nudity in them, and it caused the government to get more involved, to have some type of censorship over the movies, so people are not looking at inappropriate things. All right, so we talk about Hollywood becoming the capital of the movie industry, and it still is today. And I mentioned in the last slide that movies and radio, these two things especially, created a national culture. People all over the country could identify with the same movies, they saw the same movies, and they listened to the same radio programs in the 1920s and then throughout the 20th century. All right, the economy boomed, the technology became dramatic, and communication became easier because of the radio movies. And so this time period is definitely the dynamic decade, one of the greatest decades in American history. And I would highlight this. 1920 is a significant year, kind of like 1890, but 1920, more Americans are actually living in urban areas in the cities than in the countryside. I think this is very important. This is a shift from a rural to a more urban society, and that change begins in 1920. All right, let's talk about women during this decade. Birth control becomes actually a movement in the 1920s led by a person named Margaret Sanger. I'd highlight her. She wanted to give women more rights, okay, more control over their bodies, so she proposed the birth control movement. And we know, and most of you know this, that women achieved the greatest gain with the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, full universal suffrage, so every woman in America that's a citizen could vote because of the 19th Amendment. Women's movement also sought for the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA. I would highlight this. Many of the feminists of the 1920s wanted an amendment to the Constitution that guaranteed equality for men and also women. So, leader of this movement to get an Equal Rights Amendment and also to help pass the 19th Amendment was the militant, highlight this, National Women's Party, and they were led by a woman named Alice Paul. I think you need to know her. I think it's important in APUSH. National Women's Party, they were militant. They would go on hunger strikes. They would not eat for days to try to prove a point. They would stage marches. They would chain themselves to the White House like gates. And they were very militant, and they wanted change, and they did help pass the 19th Amendment in 1920, and they also wanted an Equal Rights Amendment, but that was not effective. You need to know the difference between the National Women's Party and NASA. NASA stands for the National American Women Suffrage Association. Don't worry about what it stands for. Just know this acronym NASA. You have to know who was a part of this. Well, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, some of the early feminists were a part of NASA. And then in the 19 teens, the leader of NASA was Carrie Chapman Catt. Know that name, I think we've learned it before. They were more for moderate change. They definitely wanted a 9th Amendment, and they were for it, and they were all gung-ho, but their means were not as militant as the National Women's Party and Alice Paul. There's definitely a difference between these two groups, but they did both want the 19th Amendment. I love our book, and I love our author, Kennedy, but I don't think he does a good enough job going into detail about these two groups, so I have a little bit more longer slide here. All right, the Equal Rights Amendment. Getting back to this, the women's movement, especially the National Women's Party, wanted this in the Constitution, saying that their equal rights under the law would not be denied on account of sex. It was proposed in 1923, but this never happened in the 1920s. It never got there. There was a push for it again in the 1970s with a more modern feminist movement. Never happened again, although it was very close. All right, more with the dynamic decade. We'd seen this term before. Talk about the modernists. They're basically the opposite of fundamentalists, more willing for change. They did reform religion in America, making it more modern. They thought God was more of a good guy instead of the hell and fire and terror of God, and instead of an angry God, more of a loving God. So they did change religion to some degree in that way. Also, the young people were called, many of them were called the Flaming Youth, and they were doing some weird things. You read about this. And they challenge conservative older folks, especially their parents and grandparents, with odd behavior. And here are some examples. Ooh, look at them. We love them. The Flappers, dancing the Charleston. But some of these flaming youth, these youth of the 1920s, would do other things such as flagpole sitting, ouch, goldfish swallowing, yum. And then one of my favorites, look at them. The love is there, although the love lasts a long time. That is marathon dancing. They would dance for hours, sometimes days, to see which couple could dance the longest without falling asleep. All right, finally, we talked about flappers before. They were the rebellious youth of women, I should say. Smoked, drank, partied, had short hair, shorter skirts. And their dance was the Charleston and jazz. Highlight this was the craze, the music craze of the 1920s, led by one of my favorites, Louis Armstrong, in the 1920s. There's more. A lot of good stuff in here. Highlight the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s. A must-know and A-push. This is a birth of African American culture in the United States in the 1920s, mostly in the city of Harlem. Harlem was basically part of New York City. It was a borough of New York City. This is where a lot of African Americans lived, and the culture boomed in the 1920s in terms of literature, also with music and jazz. And you need to know this guy, Langston Hughes, huge person in A-Push. This is what he looks like down here. He is the poet of Harlem, the poet laureate of Harlem, one of the greatest poets. Maybe you've read some of his works in some of your English classes. Another name to know is Marcus Garvey, very important, and this is Marcus Garvey over here. He was a black nationalist. I want to highlight this right here. He founded the United Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, and basically he was all about trying to promote black pride, black nationalism, and he wanted African Americans to buy goods from other African American businesses. So to keep black dollars in black pockets, make a connection to this guy. I think he'd be very similar, be a fan of probably W.E.B. Du Bois. And then later in American history in the 50s and 60s, he would probably be a friend and follower of Malcolm X. And so that is the connection to later in history. Okay, other famous African American authors and musicians, Zora Neale Hurston. I think it's important. Maybe you've heard of her book, Their Eyes Are Watching God. I think it's a great book. It's about African American struggles in the South. I think it's during the Great Depression is the study of that. She's a famous person of the Harlem Renaissance to know. And also Louis Armstrong. Love him, one of the greatest trumpet players of all time. Are you kidding me, Beamer? I got more literature. Love you. I love to read. You guys love to read. And so what I want you to know, the 1920s, the old writers were going away. They were dying. And so we got a new group of writers. And these writers of the 1920s were called the Lost Generation. Important term in A-Push. They were writers and intellectuals that were disenchanted and disillusioned from World War I. They didn't really care about politics. They kind of turned inward and were more concerned about their own happiness and satisfaction. And F. Scott Fitzgerald, one of the greatest authors of the Lost Generation, his book, The Great Gatsby, to me, is the book of the 1920s. Talks about conformity, wealth, and disillusionment. A couple other ones as well are somewhat important to keep in the back of your mind. H.L. Mencken and Sinclair Lewis. And then the connection Mencken had to the Puritans. You remember from the beginning of the year we read the book about where the Puritans, the essay where the Puritans Puritanico. And H.L. Mencken said, Puritanism is the haunting fear that someone somewhere may be happy. Now we know the Puritans did have fun in moderation, but that was the connection to earlier history. Also, one of the most famous authors in American history is Ernest Hemingway. He was disillusioned post-World War I. He actually fought and was involved in Italy during World War I on the side of the Allies. And one of his famous books, one of my favorite books, was called A Farewell to Arms. Check it out. It's a classic. It's about love. It's about the war of World War I. So Hemingway, I'm a fan. Also, for all of you architects out there, Frank Lloyd Wright was becoming the leading architect architect of the time period, the 20s. Many more skyscrapers. Any connections to the earliest known architect was, what's his name, Louis Sullivan. More, we got some economics, and the 1920s economy boomed. It was a big bull market. The stock market was unbelievable. It tripled from 1925 to 1929. So the economy was booming in the 20s, which is so ironic because the 1930s we have the worst economic time, the Great Depression. All right, highlight this. Okay, there was too much over speculation on property in the stock market, which caused the market to boom and do well. Whenever the market explodes, there's eventually going to be a big crash or a big fall, and that happened in 1929. And we know one of the biggest causes of the panics of the 1800s is over speculation, especially on property and land. And even today, in the late 2000, 2008, the housing market caused the recession of 2008, 2009. All right, too many people went into debt. That's a problem when you lose a job, when you're deep in debt. It's hard to pay things back. And many people actually bought stocks by buying on margins. So they went into debt to buy stocks. So again, a lot of people making poor choices, economic choices. All these things are eventual causes of the stock market crash and the Great Depression. Highlight this. Factory workers got very little support from unions. In fact, union membership declined in the 20s. So the 20s was great for many people, especially upper class Americans. But the laborers, the factory workers, did struggle, and the progressivism was dead by the early 1920s. All right, finally, a name I want you to know is Andrew Mellon. More about this will be in the next chapter, but he was the Secretary of the Treasury, and he reduced many taxes for the rich. He believed in trickle-down economics, give tax breaks for the rich. They'll go out and spend the money to help improve the economy. And just the overall summary of the chapter of the economy of the 20s, the prosperity was unbelievable in the 1920s, but it was setting up the big crash in 1929, leading to the worst time in American history, the 1930s, the Great Depression.